Welcome to our ninth video on our series Characters of Faith, where we get to look at a biblical character in their lives, what we can learn from them, and how we can live our lives. You see, the reality is every life tells a story, and we only get to hear about today's character because somebody else wrote a letter on their behalf. You see, Paul wrote a letter to his friend Philemon on behalf of a guy called Onesimus. So we find the whole of his story in the book of Philemon, this particular letter. You see, the background is this slave, Onesimus, had run away. He'd run away from Philemon, and somehow in his running away, he'd met Paul. And as he'd met Paul, he'd come to know Jesus for himself. And so he served Paul time and time again as Paul taught in the scriptures. Onesimus started to become really valuable to Paul in terms of his service for the gospel. But the problem is, a runaway slave should be punished, certainly never restored. And so Philemon would have had to have punished him on the way back. And yet Philemon, Paul had also led to Christ. And so Philemon was being encouraged to take this slave back because he was now a fellow Christian. You see, in this whole letter, it is all about Onesimus, his life. I want you to think about it like this. Our lives, the changes that happen to us, tell a story. What story does your life tell? What story would someone write a letter about you for? For whenever we come to know Jesus, when changes happen, others see it and read it. And so let's have a little look about what Paul said to Philemon about Onesimus. Beginning at verse 11. Formerly he was useless to you, but now he has become useful both to you and to me. And I am sending him who's my very heart back to you. I would have liked to keep him with me so that he could take your place in helping me while I am in chains for the gospel. But I did not want to do anything without your consent, so that any favor you do would not seem forced, but would be voluntary. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. Onesimus had become like a son to Paul. That's what it said in the previous verse. Paul had been comforted. Paul had been supported. As a runaway slave, he was useless. And yet, as now a follower of Jesus, he was a fellow brother of Philemon. His life had been changed and relationships had been changed. And so Paul was saying, look, this person that was formerly useless is now not only useful, but he has a heart after Jesus. And he's got an amazing testimony and amazing story to tell. This was a real living enactment of a story that Jesus had told. The story of the prodigal son, the son who'd run away and thrown everything away and thought they could only come back in disgrace. And yet the father embraced them as they came back. Paul here is actually asking Philemon, embrace your brother when he comes back. Accept him. Rebuild the relationships, for he's come to know Jesus. This change and this transformation is what happens. That's the story that was being told. Useless to useful. Lack of heart to full of heart. Untrustworthy to trustworthy. Friend for this life. Friend for eternity. That's the story. I wonder what would have been said back in the community that Philemon lived in. I wonder what would have been said as he didn't punish, but as he reconciled and took Onesimus back. It was going to be something of a public display of where Philemon should have been shamed, but because of the gospel, he was going to be willing to go the extra mile. It's what Paul had expected of him. We see this here in the letter to Philemon. Verse 17. So if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. Paul wants to demonstrate that reconciliation is public. And so in this, he is saying he knows that it will cost Philemon to take him back. But actually, the story for the gospel is far more powerful. The story of Onesimus' life and the story of Philemon's life is going to transform that town. And we see it in Paul's other letter, in his letter to Colossae. Tychicus will tell you all the news about me. He is a dear brother, a faithful minister and fellow servant in the Lord. I am sending him to you for the express purpose that you may know about our circumstances and that he may encourage your hearts. He is coming with Onesimus, our faithful and dear brother, who is one of you. They will tell you everything that is happening here. Paul is even commending him to the community, a faithful and dear brother, the runaway slave whose life is changed, the runaway slave who's useful, the runaway slave who's supportive. The community gets to accept him back. It's a story of reconciliation that's going to be played out in public. The letters were going to be read. His story was going to be known. When your life is read, when your life is like a letter and the world looks upon you, what's the story that's read? Is it the story of Paul? Paul who was willing to write a letter, Paul who led Onesimus to Christ, Paul who'd encouraged and put himself out there? Is your story more like the one of Philemon, the one who was going to accept the slave back as a brother, the one who was going to face potential public disgrace for welcoming and reconciling and restoring and bringing hope? Or was it going to be the story of Onesimus, the one who formerly was useless and now has become useful, the one whose life was transformed, who now had purpose and calling? Your life is a letter to be read. How do people read your life? Maybe you could ask one of your friends, maybe you could share it, maybe you could talk about what your testimony is, but maybe you could actually dare to ask one of them, what would it be like for them to write a letter like Paul did? What would they say? And I wonder, in them writing a letter, what you might want to do to change, to become more like Christ, or to model Christ's life in you.